How many of you would consider yourself a car person? And when I say car person, I mean someone who absolutely loves cars. Maybe you love restoring old cars. Maybe you love buying new ones. Maybe you love going to car shows. Maybe you love driving them around. Maybe you love just fixing and repairing cars. And maybe you love all of the above. Recently I read a story about a car that someone had stored in their barn from 1974 to 2015. And if you do a little quick math, that's 40 years. And then one day, the owner decides to take this car to an auction to see what it's actually worth. The car was a 1964 Shelby 289 Cobra, and he got $979,000 for it. That's almost $1 million. It's crazy that something that valuable sat in a barn for that long. I don't know what the condition the car was in. I'm not sure if the owner even knew how much that car was worth. But I do know that for the most part, when people know that something is extremely valuable, they take better care of it. The more something is worth, the better people typically treat it. So today, we're gonna talk about something that, like a 1964 Shelby 289 Cobra, has a tremendous amount of value. And it's something that, like the Shelby owner from Vermont, we often treat like just another random car stashed away in a barn. You know what we're talking about? We're talking about you. As human beings, you and I have immense value. We're created in the image of God. He sent Jesus to die for us. And as we said last week, God determined, while you and I were considered sinners and in darkness, that we were worth his very life. He loves us more than we will ever love ourselves. However, most of us don't feel like we're valuable. Think about that. If I asked you to tell me 5, maybe 10 things that you like about yourself, you'd probably struggle to come up with answers, wouldn't you? Several years ago, I took some students from our youth group to a lake house for a summer retreat. 8 students attended. The whole retreat was about gratitude. And I challenged them to dig deep, to identify things they were grateful for. People, places, things, characteristics of God, and blessings that they typically took for granted. And during the last session, I turned it towards them. I asked, what are some things about you that you're grateful for? I wasn't picky in the answers they could give. I'd take things like, I can walk or I can see. Still, even with such a low bar, they struggled to come up with anything. And I was shocked. If I would have asked them to tell me 5 to 10 things they didn't like about themselves, those answers they would have come up with quickly. But for some reason, they simply couldn't do this self-gratitude exercise. So I pivoted the session. I put a chair in the middle of the room. They all had to take turns sitting in it while everyone else in the group told them things they liked and appreciated about them. You would have thought I was torturing them. They struggled to receive the affirmations because they were so conditioned to being cruel to themselves. As human beings, why do we have so much trouble thinking positive things about ourselves? I think there are a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones is that you know you. You're with you 100% of the time. You know your own darkest thoughts and deepest struggles, and you can't get away from yourself. You can send your kids to school, you can get a break from your boss on the weekends, you can block out God or ignore your spouse, but everywhere you go, there you are. So one would assume that if you're with you at all times, you'd be kinder to yourself. But most of us are pretty mean to ourselves. We may call ourselves a terrible parent. We may tell ourselves that we can't do anything right. We may even think things like, God probably thinks I'm an idiot. We're all probably pretty critical of ourselves. And it's not even something we do intentionally. It just happens. In this series, Rooted, we're talking about identity, which is basically your view of yourself. In the same way that roots hold a plant in place, a healthy identity holds us in place. And just like roots bring water and nutrients above the surface to plants, a healthy identity reminds us of truth and brings us peace from the inside out. Identity is how we see ourselves in the light of God, ourselves, others, and the entire world. But based on the way that some of us talk to ourselves and about ourselves, I guess that for many of us, we tend to view ourselves in a really negative way. So today, we're going to counteract this way of thinking by looking at the book of Proverbs from the Old Testament. Proverbs is a book of wise sayings. What we're looking at today will give you an example of that wisdom. And this one small verse can do a lot of good when it comes to your identity. It says this: "Those who are kind benefit themselves, but the cruel bring ruin on themselves." The writer of this proverb basically said that things go well for kind people, but not so much for cruel people. And we all get this. Most of us agree that people should treat others well and that people who are kind to others benefit themselves. But for some reason, we don't think of applying this to ourselves. We've never considered that the cruel things we say about ourselves and think about ourselves have the potential to ruin us. We may be mean to ourselves after we discipline our kid, or fail to discipline our kid, or argue with our spouse, or miss church, or look in the mirror, or check our bank accounts. We can do it constantly without even noticing it. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but it creates stress. It leads us to behaving in a way that lines up with our terrible view of ourselves, and it keeps us self-consumed. Bottom line, it holds us back. But on the flip side, being kind can benefit you. When you're kind to yourself, you have more confidence. You treat others better because you're not constantly looking for a way to feel better about yourself, and you make better decisions. But this is about more than just having a healthy self-esteem and making better decisions. It's about more than how you talk to yourself and think about yourself. This is about understanding that you were created in the image of God. The same God who created vast oceans and these incredible mountains and breathtaking waterfalls, that God is reflected in you. The same God who invented love, forgiveness, laughter, and friendship is the God who put his stamp of approval on the creation of you. Look at what David wrote in the Old Testament. "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." David had lots of reasons to be critical of himself, but he knew that when he tore himself down, he was criticizing the work of God. He was insulting something that God is proud of. Instead, he reminded himself of the truth of who he was, fearfully and wonderfully created by a great and loving God. You and I can do the same when it comes to our identity. So, let your roots be grounded in truth. Let your view of who you are be rooted in what your Creator says about you. And He says that you are made in His image, and that is a big deal. God's not a fan of us taking worth away from anyone created in His image. Why would it be any different when we take worth away from ourselves? When we fill our minds with negative trash about ourselves, we're one step closer to believing them. If we just let the self-criticism fly without a challenge, we're getting dangerously closer to it affecting our faith and our identity. But on the flip side, what if you constantly reinforced God's truth about who you are? Imagine if you spoke a big, good vision into your own life and future. You think that would do anything but make you, your faith, and your relationship better? If God created us, shouldn't we affirm His work? And wouldn't He be more pleased for us to treat ourselves in a way that lines up with how He wants us to treat others? Maybe that's why thousands of years after the book of Proverbs was written, the Apostle Paul gave us an idea of how to begin changing the way we think. In a letter to Jesus' followers in the city of Colossae, he wrote this: "But now, you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips." We read this and see the obvious application. Don't treat other people in these ways. At the same time, we need to avoid treating ourselves this way. Most of us are aware of our own flaws, our shortcomings, our weaknesses. Most of us know things we'd love to change about our behavior or our physical appearance. Most of us can pretty quickly identify situations that we don't handle well and behavior that needs to improve. You know, being aware of what needs to change is good. Deciding to get better in an area is great. But being cruel to or angry with yourself, it isn't. When you find yourself saying things to yourself that you'd never say to anyone else, you've probably crossed the line into cruelty. And that, according to Paul, is something we need to get rid of in how we treat anyone, including ourselves. So in light of what we talked about today, here are some steps that you and I can take to root ourselves in truth. First, recognize when you're being cruel to yourself. Pay attention when you're speaking terrible things into your own identity. Acknowledge that it isn't God's best for you. Just admit that you would never say those things to someone else, and it would probably make your life better if you no longer said them to yourself. Then, replace those thoughts and messages with something better. A few verses earlier, Paul gave us an idea of what that would look like. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. According to Paul, you can choose to place your mind somewhere else. You literally have control over what you think about. You can't control when a thought pops up, but you can absolutely decide whether it's worth setting your mind on it all day. What if the things you thought about yourself and said to yourself lined up with the things of heaven? I think you'd have a better life. But this isn't just about thinking happy thoughts and telling yourself that you're awesome. This is about replacing earthly thoughts with godly thoughts. Instead of being consumed with you, focus on the one who made you. If you don't feel great, remember that He is great. If you don't feel strong, smart, or capable, remember that God is. And when you feel like your life is worthless, remember that God sent Jesus because you are so valuable to Him. A great way to do this is to find some verses to write down or print out. Choose verses that reinforce who God is and how He sees you. And the moment you recognize that you are being cruel to yourself, read those verses and pray them out loud. Because when you set your mind on truths that come from the one who made you, it will lead you to being kinder to yourself. And in that process, your faith and your relationships will improve as well. It will make things better for you. And it's time. It is time to begin replacing lies with truth. Because you are created in the image of a God who is crazy about you. And just like He wants you to be kind to others, He wants you to be kind to yourself. Jesus is fused into your very being. So let that shape your view of you. Let your roots be grounded in truth.